You know, I sought out to become associated with Spider-Man. When I first started working with Marvel, I saw Spider-Man as like, that's the character I want to become associated with. I think it's trying to, it's a tall task, but trying to imagine in advance what could possibly have the potential of being an iconic cover. That's a big word. But when I think of all the comic book covers that have stood out to me over the years, that's the word I use. It's like, what are these iconic images that have lived on way past the stories inside the books and became kind of like legendary images in and of themselves years and years down the road, usually decades down the road. So you're not always successful, but I think, and sometimes certain opportunities don't always have the same opportunity to make it an iconic cover, but whenever I see those opportunities, I always try to make a run at it and see, is this one of those chances I have to do something that's going to last, hopefully for not just years and years, but maybe even decades. I don't know how many Spider-Man covers I've done by now. I'm sure
a lot.
It is a lot. It is definitely a lot. I don't know if I'm in the triple digits yet, but I must be getting close by now if I'm not. But it's definitely a lot. You know, I sought out to become associated with Spider-Man. When I first started working with Marvel, I saw Spider-Man as like, that's the character I want to become associated with. And I looked for every opportunity that came up to navigate myself in such a way where I took on a lot of Spider-Man covers. And then also made the intent to sort of not just draw the female characters associated with Spider-Man, such as Mary Jane, Black Cat, and then later on when Gwen Stacy started reemerging, but to sort of like not just draw those characters, but to hopefully leave a unique impression on them. I didn't want to just draw them the way they'd always been drawn. I wanted to try to do something unique with their styling and stuff like that that would be specifically my mark that I would leave on it, and I'm very happy to say I feel like I've done that. So. There was an image I had in my mind for a few years, well, maybe a year, and it was this quieter image I had in mind of Mary Jane in the apartment in New York with Spider-Man in the distance, like he had just jumped out the window moments ago and he's off being called away from her again. And I had this idea, like I said, it would be kind of somber, a little bit melancholy. She'd be almost a little bit sad. You would see the apartment, which is very, I mean, I almost broke all my typical rules. My rules typically are, don't do too much clutter in the background. Don't make the background brown or gray. You know, like, and literally, I did all those things in this image. And I remember drawing the image as a pinup at first, like a print that Marvel gave me permission to take to the New York Comic Con at the time. And my thought was, Marvel will hopefully let me do this image as a print because they'll never want it as a cover. It's too quiet. You know what I mean? That kind of thing. Turns out, very shortly after Marvel did come to me and said, you know, we'd like to turn that into a cover as well. Cut to like 10 years later, it's maybe the cover people come up to me the most and say they just connected with this cover. This cover has just kind of lived on and had a life of its own, and I'm thankful to sort of, if I could put humility aside to some degree, I think that's the closest I've come to an iconic cover that's kind of lived beyond sort of what it ever was originally intended to be. You know, for me, I really connected with Spidey in the 80s, late 80s, when Todd McFarlane was drawing Spider-Man. And I remember it just leapt off the page. It just seemed like he was doing things and breaking rules and just completely making Spider-Man his own. You could not mistake Todd McFarlane Spider-Man for anybody else. And I remember when I first started drawing Spider-Man thinking, okay, I can't repeat him, I can't copy him, as tempting as it is, but if I can in any way leave even the smallest of that sort of impression on the character, kind of leave something where it's identifiable as me who drew it, that was my goal, is to sort of say, you know, he set the bar for my generation, I think, when I was coming into the business. And I still always, even though obviously many amazing artists have tackled Spider-Man, Todd McFarlane really is the one who left the mark for me and my generation. You know, I was fortunate enough to be interested in a career in comic books in my late teens and very early 20s, just as the image boom was happening, which was probably at the peak. I mean, I think comic books were just it was shortly after the Keaton, Tim Burton Batman movie, and comic books were just exploding. And yeah, Todd McFarlane, who I mentioned, and Jim Lee, at that point had broken off with some other artists to form Image Comics. And up until then, I was told that comic book companies would never actively look for talent, to not go about getting into the comic book industry, expecting them to look for you. And strangely enough, shortly after that, Jim Lee put an ad in the back of his comic book looking for talent. And I was going, oh my gosh, this is that thing they said they never do, and they're doing it. And I think that just shows how much there was a demand for new talent to fill the ranks in these, the ambitions of these new studios that were popping up. And I was very grateful to get hired by Jim Lee very shortly after I sent him some samples. In fact, he actually called me up. And it was as though George Lucas had called me up. I mean, I was like totally dumbfounded that this idol of mine was calling me up at my house to say if I wanted to pick up and move to San Diego and become an intern at his.
What samples did you send him? What characters?
You know, it's funny you say that actually. The book at the time he was doing was Wildcats, which was kind of I think when he broke off to Image, everybody kind of did a little bit of something that was reminiscent of what they did at Marvel. I think. When Todd did Spawn, there was Spider-Man elements to Spawn, kind of, I think, in a way. And Jim doing Wildcats, there was definitely a X-Men kind of vibe going on with the Wildcats. And my thought was, well, I was already thinking commercially back then. I was kind of going like, well, he's probably going to want to imagine me drawing these new characters. So let me do 3 sample pages. It was just a fake, just a made-up fight scene where they were running through some corridor or something like that. And I drew the Wildcats at the time. And I think that definitely did the trick, because not only did they see my talent, but they could probably see that I thought in a business sense. I knew they could tell I was trying to help them and help Jim grow what he was already starting. So when you're in the midst of Jim Lee and Todd McFarlane and Rob Liefeld, these were big personalities, and they filled a room, and it gave me a different perspective of what an artist could be. My perception always was the artist is the quiet kid in the back of the high school class doodling and all dressed in black, that sort of attitude. And I kind of saw from these guys a bigger, larger-than-life presence. And I picked up a lot of that, like just the confidence that they signed their name, the confidence and boldness of their artwork. And that did translate into what I think was the early version of brands, or at least artist branding. And that stayed with me. In fact, actually, it kind of gave me an unapologetic boldness to kind of move forward with my own brand, too. Because sometimes branding yourself, sometimes it comes in conflict with artists tend to want to keep themselves small in some way, or like, oh, I'm not worthy, or this isn't my best work. And it's just, I think the nature of an artist to sometimes have those inner thoughts, and sometimes those inner thoughts come out. But when you're thinking about a brand, you kind of have to be a little more restrained about that. The branding is sort of like the confidence you're trying to put out in the world. It's the better version, or the more positive aspect of being an artist, the part that maybe you don't think your stuff's the best, but you've got to sort of toot your own horn a little bit with that. And I would look at booths like the Marvel booth at Comic-Con and these other booths, and I go like, why can't I be a brand like these? Because look how excited they get when they see the Marvel logo. Look how excited they get when they see that drawing I did blown up really big at another booth. So why not embrace that myself and sort of say, hey, I can do that too. I can make my brand bigger than life, and that creates excitement. The fans love to be excited by what you're doing. They love to see it bigger than life. So to me, I think it was a good learning process back then in the early stages, and as the years have gone on, I've just grown to appreciate artists who have not just a brand, but just a voice, a unique vision. I think you have to have an identity that you really go out there boldly with to be successful in this business. You have to go out there with that kind of confidence. Even if you have to fake it till you make it, you kind of got to go out there with that sort of like, I'm going to tackle the world, because that's the kind of energy and excitement that gets fans on board, and they go, yeah, I love that too. That's great. I find that they tend to want to jump on board that train. We actually just had our 20th anniversary of Danger Girl this year, since the first issue came out towards the later, well, it would have been 1998. And yeah, it's funny. I've dabbled with the idea back and forth for years, and it's just, I think the challenge has always been just finding that chunk of time that I can dedicate to just doing that. These days, I have so many projects and so many plates spinning. The idea of the discipline and the sort of the time it would take to sit down and really not just come up with a new storyline, but to actually like see it through and sort of like from start to finish. It's funny. I realized just how fearless I was back 20 years ago when I did that, because looking at what I did, if I knew the challenges that it would take to get through that, it's enough to scare anybody pretty much. The discipline and the energy and the time it takes to get that accomplished. But I still like the idea of thinking I would eventually get back to it. But these days I have so many different projects. I just honestly don't know where I would fit it in actually. So that's the biggest challenge. As long as I've been doing this, I've actually been fortunate enough to do quite a few that there's very few left on that checklist kind of. One of the ones that comes to mind is I've never done Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. That's kind of a funny one because it's iconic from when I was younger in the 80s and that kind of thing.
That'd be interesting to see in the J. Scott Campbell
That would be
style.
fun, and I think it'd probably be a good fit too because my style kind of can veer into a little bit more of the toony kind of side of things and kind of give that energetic vibe. So. In fact, actually, I think it was like in the early 2000s, there was a big 80s boom where all the stuff from the 80s was coming back, and I actually was able to touch on a lot of those iconic properties when they came back around in the early 2000s, and that was one that kind of slipped through. I didn't really get to do anything with the Turtles, but that might be a fun one to try.
I'd like to see you take on Dazzler at some point.
Dazzler, that's a good one. I've never drawn Dazzler. That's true.
J. Scott Campbell, Disco Dazzler.
That's true. I might have drawn the '90s Dazzler, but not that classic disco one. That would be fun. That would be really good. I gotta mark that one down. That's a good one.